not encouraging or advising anyone to modify their firearms. This is for entertainment and educational purposes only. What's up, everyone? I got the slide serrations and the muzzle bevel machined. I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail about my serration design and the machining process. This video would be pretty short otherwise, kind of like, hey, I machined the slide serrations, here they are. Okay, bye. I opted to machine the muzzle bevel. I'm pretty handy with a file, but I didn't trust myself to do it by hand and have it come out nice. If you're not into machining or curious about it, this will probably be a bit boring, but let's get into it. First, I made a detailed 3D model of the outside of the slide. Modeling up slides is always a little challenging and a good design exercise for me. Once I had that done, I played with different serration designs. I looked at and measured serrations on a bunch of my pistols. I tried out so many, literally hours of different sketches and extrusions. I was considering all sorts of things, but I had to keep in mind the limitations of the manual machine and my machining skills. What angle are the serrations? Say it with me, everyone. 18 degrees, right? Same as the grip angle of the 1911? No, they're 15 degrees. I think Caspian and Springfield do theirs at 15 degrees. This seems to be rather common, and it's much easier to set up without a swivel vise, which I don't have. Arguably, that 3-degree difference won't be that noticeable anyways. I settled on this design, nothing really new here, kind of copying some Atlas designs, a gradient of serration widths radiating from the center, equal spacing in between cuts using 3/16, quarter, 5/16, and 3/8 inch end mills, all common sizes. The 3/8 width at the end is the same width as the thumb safety cutout, and I wanted to center it over that. This dictated the location of the rear serrations. I wanted serrations over the top, so I projected lines to the top surface because I wanted them to look like they were kind of continuous and wrapped up and over. The width of the top cut is the hypotenuse of this right triangle, so they are all slightly wider than the end mill size of their respective side serration. The location of the front and top serrations was based on about where I thought I would be gripping the slide. Then I modeled up the front sight and checked their position in relation to that. I didn't want to connect the serrations across the 45 flat. It would greatly increase machining time and difficulty. Any little mismatch in location where the lines meet at a corner, even a few thou, the human eye will generally pick that up. This design was about as complicated as I wanted to get while still being reasonable for me to machine, even though it would take multiple setups and tool changes. The front serrations are 30 thou deep because I wanted them grippy. The rear are 20 thou because I likely won't be using them at all with the optic mounted. The top serrations are 20 deep. I pinch over the top with my thumb and index finger so the soft web of my hand will be contacting the top serrations. I didn't want them to be as aggressive. I also modeled up my muzzle bevel. This slide has a little strip of a 55-degree angle between the 45 and sides. I wasn't going to do that little bit by hand or try to machine it, so this is what they're going to look like. 30 thousandths by 45, just large enough to take away that dent I put in the front of the slide from dropping it in episode 1. I created the drawing and tried to dimension it how I thought I would be manually machining it, while also minimizing setup and tooling changes. I created ordinate dimensions from the front serration. The first cut uses the corner of the slide as a reference. Then I dimensioned the width to reference what end mill would be used for each cut, then boxed those dimensions with different shapes. The 3/16 end mill is a triangle box. Use the triangle-sized end mill to machine the triangle dimension cuts. Trying to save me from myself here. Since the upper serrations are wider than their respective side serrations, they would take 2 cuts with that end mill size, both slightly offset from center to achieve the proper width. Changing end mills and touching off to re-zero the z-axis every time is a pain, and I would already be doing a lot of that on the sides. So I dimensioned them all to be cut with the 3/16 end mill, the smallest one needed for the rearmost cut. I wrote myself a note to remind me that the top of the slide is not parallel to the frame rails. I needed to dial it in to make sure it was parallel to the machine table. I also wrote myself notes regarding the depth of cut in different locations and a reminder of the 15-degree angle of the serrations. This drawing ended up being great and was dimensioned in a way that made machining and setup as easy as it could be. I wanted to do some practice machining to see how the slide material would cut, but I remembered I had already machined it along the spring plug tunnel a little when fitting the slide to frame, and it machined really nicely. This isn't very hard in terms of 4140. It's not a gnarly heat treat. 4140 also doesn't work hardened too bad, and I wouldn't be hogging on it so much that I would need to worry about putting too much heat into it. I bought all new carbide 4-flute end mills for this. My dad was also confident it wouldn't be an issue. My dad worked with me the whole time. The mill I use is his. It's in his shop. He is a much more experienced machinist than me. It's really fun to hang out with him and do projects like these. I also learn a lot and have a second, much more experienced set of eyes on it, so I'm less likely to fuck it up. I started with the muzzle bevel on the side of the slide and dust cover. The Atlas slide is slightly wider than the Chile frame, so I wanted to carry the bevel across both to blend them together. My vise was already dialed in parallel to the x-axis. I assembled the slide and frame with the barrel, recoil assembly, and slide stop. The muzzle is perpendicular to the frame rails, or the bottom of the dust cover in this case, so I needed that surface flush against my vise jaw, not the tapered top of the slide. I had to use parallels of the correct height to clear the trigger gar screw nub. Once I snugged the vise by hand, the muzzle could pretty easily move back and forth. So I stuck a gauge pin in the front sight dovetail to take up that difference due to the taper. This worked pretty well. I touched off with my chamfer tool, zeroed, then took a 10 thou pass. It cut fine. I did the other 20 for my total of 30. I flipped the slide and frame over, clamped it the same way, touched off, zeroed, and took all 30 thou at once. Then I took the slide off the frame so I could machine a bevel on the bottom of the frame Picatinny rail. I clamped the slide upright in the vise and dialed in the top to make sure it was parallel to the table. I cut the top bevel. I cut my slide serrations at this point too. A tilting vise was used to cut the bevel on the 45s of the tri-top. This setup was a pain in the ass. The vise and quill were interfering. I reoriented it and swept it in again. Then the y-axis couldn't travel enough to get to the far edge. We had to swing the head over, and it was so close I couldn't move my y-axis anymore, so I had to plunge my 30 thou chamfer. Luckily, 30 thou down and 30 thou over are the same on a 45-degree chamfer. We flipped the slide around to do the other side. We had to swing the head back over to center. It was harder to see because it was facing away from us, but we got both of them done. I machined the top serrations after I machined the top bevel, and the slide top was already dialed in parallel to the table. I applied die chem and used an edge finder to zero my x-axis on the muzzle. I traveled to the first cut location and touched off on the top of the slide with the 3/16 end mill to zero my z-axis. I machined all 3 passes of the front slot at 10 thou deep, half of the 20 thou depth. This was to make sure it cut okay. I then cut that one to the final 20 thou depth. The rest of the top serrations I cut at the full 20 thou and slowed my travel speed a little bit. I checked the depth, and you can see that I am 1.5 to 2 thou deeper than 20, so my zero method was good enough. Now it was time to set the mill vise at 15 degrees. Whenever you move a mill vise, my dad told me it's best practice to completely remove it and clean the table and bottom of the vise off, then put it back on. If you were to just unclamp it and pivot it, a little chip hanging out on the table may get in between the two and scratch shit up, or possibly space the vise up off the table on one side. We put the vise on the table and installed a hold down bolt on one side, then a clamp on the other. The 15-degree angle is easy because you can buy angle blocks. 15 degrees is a common angle, 18 is not. You can indicate the vise jaw to whatever angle you want. Like if you travel an inch, how far should the indicator move in the other direction? This would just be the tangent of your angle multiplied by 1 inch. Sweeping across the block clamped in the vise and making it 0 on both ends is quicker and easier. I had to clamp the slide at the right height so I could machine 30 thou deep, but the vise would be contacting both sides of the frame rails. I had to shim up a set of parallels with a straight edge to get this. My datum was the front bottom corner of the slide. I used a pointer to zero my axes. This would be close enough. I would travel along the y-axis to make the cut, so that didn't need zeroed, but I did line it up to help me zero the x-axis. I traveled to my first cut location and zeroed the DRO. With the 3/8 end mill, I touched off to zero my z-axis. I did the first cut 10 thou at a time. It was cutting fine. My dad was the lube man. We don't have a cool miss setup. He was doing good work. We figured we could take 30 thou depth in one pass and not end up with a terrible finish. With the 3/8 mill still installed, I traveled to the 3/8 wide rear cut location. I didn't need to zero my Z-axis again. The rear serrations are 20 thou deep, so I dialed that in and made the cut. I installed the 5/16 end mill, traveled to the location of the next forward serration of the rear serration group, touched off to zero my Z-axis because I installed a new bit, then made that 20 thou deep cut in one pass. I moved to the forward 5/16 cut location and cut that 30 thou deep serration. This process was repeated for the 1/4 and 3/16 end mills. Then we had to do the other side. We had to move the vise 15 degrees in the other direction. We swept it in with the indicator and angle block and cinched it down, clamped the slide, and machined the serrations on that side in the same way. Of course, I will share my mistakes with you. First, I clamped the slide a little too hard with that gauge pin in the dovetail. It left a little mark. It's not a big deal. I've cleaned it up and it's not very noticeable. On one of the rear serrations, I touched off in the wrong location. I am quite dyslexic and read my drawing wrong, so I dialed my location as 4.962 instead of 4.926. I touched off in that location, but my dad caught it before I made the cut, thank God. So I had a little mark there, maybe 1 thou deep. It sanded out very easily. When I was dicking around with trying to set up the tilting vise to machine the bevel on the 45 of the tri-top, I was looking for clearance somewhere else and poked the chamfer tool into my slide. It left a good little mark. It mushroomed up some metal. I filed that off and sanded that area down with the rest of the bottom of that cut. It's pretty close to the bottom of the optic plate, so I don't think it will be too noticeable. It's a bummer, but not a lot more I can do about it. There were minor machining marks in all of the cuts and chamfers I made around the muzzle. I could barely feel these, so they were probably no more than 2 thou deep. The mill I used doesn't have a VFD, so changing RPMs means changing belts, and that's a pain. I ran all the end mills at 1600 RPM, which probably wasn't too good for the larger diameter ones. I traveled slow but don't have power feed, so it probably wasn't very constant. I didn't see any improvement in machining marks taking a shallower or deeper cut. They sanded out with 400, then 600 grit and some oil pretty quickly. The whole cleanup process took a couple hours because I had 20 grooves to do. I cleaned the muzzle bevels up with fine stones. That went pretty quick. This whole slide will be media blasted prior to nitride treatment. There are still some very faint machining marks and sanding scratches, but they can't be more than about 1 thou deep, and they should go away with media blasting. If they don't, I can sand them more and then re-blast them. I'm pretty happy with how this came out. I think the finish of the slide should even out nicely with media blasting and look pretty damn good after the QPQ nitride process. This was a good design exercise and a good machining project that I learned a lot from. It was a really fun project to tackle with my dad. It was a cool way to make this pistol uniquely my own, but it was a pain. I would not be too keen on doing this again, or if I did, maybe make the design a little simpler. Atlas doesn't offer a 4.6-inch slide with serrations that I could have used for this build. They have one, but it's made for a sight blocker comp, so it's not the correct length. Anyways, that's all for this one. I think the next few videos will be about getting components ready for finishing and treatment. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.